My name is Geoff Mulgan. I'm Chief Executive of Nesta, which is the UK's National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts.
Excellent. So, the experiment that's happening here, is about overcoming these huge problems, right? And I'm sure in your position, right, you are constantly busy. You're constantly doing, trying to solve these issues. What compelled you to accept the invitation to come here and actually partake in this?
I've worked for quite a lot of governments around the world, sometimes sort of top-down jobs on strategy and policy, and also working often with entrepreneurs and innovators from the grassroots, working upwards. And I think we are in a sort of fascinating moment of an incompleted transition. I've worked quite a bit with governments around the world, usually looking top-down on strategy and policy, and then sometimes working with innovators from the grassroots, looking upwards. We're in a fascinating period of transition now where everyone realises our forms of both government and politics and democracy were essentially crystallised in the late 19th century. You can see that in the buildings, the processes we have, and have increasingly become anachronistic, but almost nowhere has broken through to the 21st century equivalents. I see at least four sort of fields of convergence trying to change that. One is about government becoming much more consciously experimental. We're part of various networks of labs and teams around the world trying to do sometimes very narrow experiments on the wording of a form or the script for a call centre, and much bigger ones around healthcare or education, etc. And I see a huge transformation potentially happening as governments become deliberately, consciously, intelligently experimental. There's a second overlapping shift around evidence, being much more rigorous and conscious about the orchestration of evidence. And the UK just a few weeks ago, government accepted a recommendation we had made of creating 6 what works centres to be the orchestrators both of formal evidence and of real-time data and all the kind of feedback mechanisms which help governments be smart. And I should say that in fact the field of digital technologies in government is rather weak on evidence and needs to catch up with the rest of the field. There's then the question of how do you make governments networked internally and escaping from the vertical silos of the 19th century. Lots of experiment around the world in horizontal budgets, teams, policy making, targets, knowledge management, etc. But most people in most governments are wholly unaware of what's been tried, let alone what is possible, and so they're trapped by the legacy of the past. And then finally, we've got the experiments with a new relationship with the citizen. How do you open up again, parliaments, policy-making processes, implementation processes, to much more continual feedback, much more engagement in setting priorities, making decisions, being creative, where government increasingly has to be about mobilisation as well as management, about a conversation rather than just periodic elections. But, and the reason I'm here, is that I know lots of the fragments of answers to that around the world, but nowhere are they yet being properly brought together, nowhere is the full potential of the new models being achieved.
And that is what you're getting here. You're getting all the other fragments? Is that what you're feeling so far?
I think potentially there is a brain power, a coalition, an authority in some of the people here which could take these things to the next stage at the level of a city or a national government or perhaps a policy area. And for me, the test is whether we can quite quickly move to actions. And they have to be actions which learn from what went wrong, because many of these things didn't quite work out as planned, whether it's crowdsourcing platforms or deliberative participatory budgeting and so on. There's a lot of experience of where, as it were, some of the theories of open government, transparency, etc., didn't quite work out. And that's always the most interesting moment, when you can learn, from what didn't happen as well as what did.
That's the thing I hear a lot from innovators, is that one of the things they like to do is make a mistake. And it's because they're able to reiterate it and change and make their process a little bit better. So then what are the solutions that you've been exploring at Nesta?
Well, at Nesta, we do a lot of things in this sort of space. We're often a commissioner of digital technologies. They may be very local platforms for mashing and mining data around transport or education or health. We're an investor in commercial technologies. We now have a joint team with the UK Cabinet Office, mainly supporting projects which are about mobilising public engagement and time and energy around things like schooling or helping unemployed people into jobs or helping offenders. We've been doing a lot of work on next generation healthcare. How do you get patients much more in control of managing budgets treatments, much more horizontal network structures of healthcare than the traditional hospitals, and many, many other examples of that kind. The other thing we're involved in, which is perhaps a big overlap with GovLab, is trying to become more systematic about really the skills and methods involved in doing innovation. And my frustration over many years is that often really innovative people are simply unaware of what's worked and what hasn't in terms of method. And so they repeat unnecessary mistakes, or we get at conferences where people give sort of glitzy presentations, but where there's no real edge, there's no real learning, there's no real reflection on the difficultness and the things which didn't work. So we're trying to systematize really an innovation curriculum, whether it's for startup entrepreneurs or for policymakers or for people in banks and so on, to help the process of innovation be that much more intelligent, systematic, etc. And that's a long process. We're working with quite a lot of governments around the world, foundations, big businesses, and others. But I see our task and the GovLab task as being, as in so many fields, the missing bit is the intelligent orchestration of knowledge. There's not a shortage of creativity, there's not a shortage of interesting projects, but the whole is much less than the sum of its parts, and that's one of the reasons why inefficient incumbent models survive much longer than they should.
So then in just this short time then that you've been talking to people, and what is it, the first half day here, what are some of the greatest insights you've seen, or what are some of the most beneficial ones that you've seen?
We've been working today on a really interesting project, which I sort of brought here, which was the question of how could you make innovation spending in nations much more democratic. So traditionally, the big R&D budgets in countries like this, or the UK or France or Germany, have been dominated either by big government, mainly by the military, or by big business. And there's been very little public engagement in priority setting, needs, shaping ideas, etc. These are almost less democratized fields of government activity than almost any other. So
you see that problem everywhere.
It's much more in the big military countries like, say, US, UK, Russia, etc. The smaller, less militarized countries don't have this quite so much, but there's an element of that pretty much everywhere. So we've been asking the question, what if a government set aside 10%, 20% of their R&D budgets to much more public engagement, to the public arguing through what are the big problems in their lives which need innovation, need new ideas, need new solutions, having much more open platforms for generating projects and ideas which people can support or vote for or co-fund through crowdfunding platforms. And how do we really open up this whole system of essentially creativity to new methods, some very web-based, some very offline, and just see where that gets us.
I guess I want to drill into this more, and it's like, how do you convince the governments to take that money, and they say you want us to put it into a website, or people are going to talk about things? What is the case study? What is the proof or evidence that you're showing them to saying these are things that work?
This would be a great experiment. No one's done it, but we've started a bit of work on how this would function through discussion groups and focus groups with the public, asking what are the things in your lives which need innovation. And in a country like the UK or much of Europe, many things come up, but one very striking one is the problem of aging and care, rising levels of dementia and depression and Alzheimer's amongst the elderly, and the current innovation system, which spends huge amounts of money on pharmaceutical solutions, just isn't working very well in meeting their needs. So we've got a need, a failing innovation system, and really a demand for different kinds of innovation, which some of which will use technology, but a lot of it will be about social innovation, designing new service models, new models of support or training of spouses and so on. This is a sort of a territory where I'd be pretty surprised you couldn't make a lot of progress through a different kind of model of running innovation rather than just channeling billions and billions of dollars through big pharma companies. But it's an experiment, and that's why we would argue do it on a fairly small scale, de-risk it, see how it goes. Similarly, if you open up R&D funding to for example, giving every citizen in the US a $20 credit, which is roughly their share of 10% of your R&D budget, and ask them, where would you spend that? What would be the priorities that would go on? In some ways, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. We need government to be able to experiment on these things. I cannot give a cast iron guarantee to a Secretary of State or a President, this will work, this will be a glorious success. But I can guarantee that you will learn a hell of a lot through the process. You may well find you're able to put money to where it really achieves much more impact for citizens than the current R&D system, which comes up with ever smarter drones or yet more drugs which don't actually meet people's needs. It would be surprising if you didn't see quite significant gain out of it.
I like that. Yeah, and I think it is something that with the innovation that happens in the military, why can't we start applying some of that innovation to all the other parts of government?
And there's a little bit of a progress in this direction with the greater use of inducement prizes, which is happening all over the world, including here through organisations like NASA and Incentive and X Prize Foundation. We have a Centre for Challenge Prizes at Nesta, running a lot of these sort of prizes. For me, a wonderful moment last year came when the Intel Science Prize was awarded to a 15-year-old who'd come up with a better test for pancreatic cancer than all the big well-funded research labs in the big universities, and he'd mainly taught himself on the internet. But that's a sign we are in an era when innovation is becoming democratized as never before. It's no longer just about big science, big government, men in white coats in secretive laboratories. But our systems haven't caught up with that. They are still essentially pumping ever larger sums of money through a much more closed, secretive, elitist system, when in fact the reality is innovation's been opened up.
So, I don't want to keep you for too long because I know there's so much going on out there, but I have a couple more questions. So one of the things that we're trying to do with GovLab as well is to create this space that you were talking about, and how do we make it a more systematic approach to innovation? What are the questions that we can ask to develop this research field? How can we explore, what areas do we need to be exploring more to increase citizen engagement?
Well, there are two top priorities, I think, for the next year or two in the sort of field which is gathered here. One is to learn the lessons from open data and what's worked and what hasn't worked.
What has worked and what hasn't?
And I see it as, in some ways, a field which has been a great triumph, and in some ways a great disappointment. It's been a great triumph in the huge number of public data sets opened up, a triumph in the new industries growing up around some parts of that, like transport, a triumph in some parts of the world where corruption is being revealed, and a triumph in that most governments treat it now as a default that data should be open. But it's also been a great disappointment. Most of those data sets aren't being used at all. Almost no one feels very threatened by the open data movement, which is a bit of a telltale sign. No major incumbent vested interests are actually being challenged, and life is essentially continuing as before. So there are two lessons which I learn from that. One is this is yet another case of what's happened again and again through the history of technology, of insufficient attention to use and the real needs people had for solutions. This is a field largely dominated by the enthusiasts, the techies, with great new, amazing solutions in search of problems. And the lesson of 150 years of innovation is often it's much more useful to start with the user experience, start with really compelling problems and work backwards from them rather than forwards from the solution. And the whole field needs much more attention to use, much more intermediaries, much more marketplaces linking supply and demand, and this is one of the things we're working much more on at my organisation. The second issue, though, is perhaps the more challenging one, which is digital technologies make it possible to really rethink whole systems. And indeed their full benefit only comes when you re-engineer the whole system around them, as has happened in fields like retailing, but hasn't happened really to almost any public service. We've been doing a lot of work on systemic innovation, what's been learned about methods for systemic innovation, and how do you align, as it were, the big sort of visionary work of really reimagining how an entire health system or food system or education system could be different, making full use of digital technologies, getting agencies like mine to fund the experiments, the pilots, the projects which demonstrate elements of a transformed system, opening up for entrepreneurialism to create new business models on the edges, but then having political will to put all the pieces together. Very little of that is happening around the world at the moment, and as a result, many of the digital solutions are little add-ons. They're not really changing the underlying sort of business processes of government, and that's why, for me, there is a disappointment in this field. But moving to systemic innovation is quite challenging, quite demanding, both intellectually and politically. But all I'd say is, and we've published quite a few pieces on this. It has happened a lot in the past. It's not impossible. And a good example, you've got plastic bottles here on the table, is the waste system. The waste system has been completely revolutionized in the last 20 or 25 years, from a situation where these bottles would have been buried in a landfill somewhere outside New York, New Jersey, to a system where very high percentages of these are recycled or turned into energy. New business models have come about, new regulations, new laws, but also dramatic changes to public behavior. So, every Sunday evening I separate out my household waste in a way which was unthinkable a generation ago. So systems can change in very fundamental ways, but they need that alignment of really the big vision, the big levers of law and regulation, new business models, new technologies, and also we, the public, have to change. And I'm looking really for that level of ambition from this sort of group, which isn't so much starting with the technology, but it's thinking through how, with the help of technology, can we completely re-engineer some of the fundamental systems we need for life.
It's almost like getting everyone on the same page or the same baseline to say we need to operate from this level, as opposed to just making apps and apps and apps for everything. We need to actually change the thing that we're putting the apps on.
Yeah, so most of the apps and the appathons and hackathons, I've become more and more frustrated that nothing is happening to those. So that was a useful phase to go through, but that phase is now over, hence the focus on use in relation to things like apps. But the lesson I take from fields like waste, which have been through a systemic transformation, is it's once you get the vision really clear, then people can align their actions, whether they are a lawmaker or a small business or a social activist. And it's then the cumulative effect of lots of different actions then takes you to a different kind of system. But you have to stand back. You have to think systemically, otherwise so much energy goes to waste.
How can we make government more agile but still maintain a level of due process, right? How can we still maintain the protections that citizens have, but still making it more horizontal and making it more flexible?
I think in all government, there has to be a balance, really a hybrid between elements which are vertical, elements which are horizontal, elements which are very fast and agile, and elements which are by their nature quite slow and steady. Many of our problems come from the fact that governments do very fast the things which should be slow, and slow the things which should be fast. And so I wouldn't want to see governments which were agile in everything. That would be a disaster.
I kind of want to hear what you think government does fast and what government does slow.
Well, in my experience, many ministers I've worked for implemented programs much too fast. And if they are fundamental programs involving change in behavior and cultures and so on, these by their nature take 3, 5, 10 years. And if you try and do it very fast, you do it very inefficiently, it doesn't work, and you've wasted a lot of money. So it's really important, and this is part of my sort of core, skill base is on public strategy, and much of that is understanding what are the rhythms of change of different fields. The rhythm of change of rebuilding a city's infrastructure system is completely different from overhauling the mayor's website. And as I say, many politicians get this wrong. And a lot of what we want out of government is by its nature slow, steady, predictable. We do not want lots of experimentation around traffic light colours or inspection regimes for nuclear power stations. There are many fields where we need process, continuity, etc. But then there are other areas of government where you need dramatically enhanced speed of experimentation, learning, etc. So much around digital technology should be done with a completely different culture from transport system management or education curriculum design or these sort of things, and requires teams with much more freedom to take risks, to make mistakes, to bring in outside experiences. And indeed the models I would always advocate for those parts of government are hybrids where they're half inside, half outside. Half the people are civil servants, half are entrepreneurs or whatever from outside, which is what we've done with strategy units around the world. So similarly, I wouldn't want all government to be horizontal. That would be a bit disastrous. We need some functions which are, again, highly vertical, highly command and control. And the idea, which was fashionable 20, 30 years ago, that we were moving from a age of hierarchy to an age of networks, from vertical to horizontal, we've learned again and again that's slightly the wrong way of formulating things. It's really how do we get the right balance between a minimum necessary hierarchy and horizontal network structures If you remove them altogether, you end up with disaster and chaos, and that has happened repeatedly in cities and other administrations. So we almost need a new language here, where a lot of the rhetoric around networks and open systems was probably right for its time, 20, 30 years ago, but sounds very naive now. And it's about how we get, again, we're in an age of hybrids and combinations. And that's a subtler task, but actually a more interesting one, I think.
Geoff, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you.
Great.